Imagine being the ninth wealthiest football club on the planet. A stadium that cost over £1 billion to build. A club that just 6 years ago played in a Champions League final. Now imagine that same club being in a genuine, serious, no longer deniable battle to avoid relegation. Not a fluke, not a bad month. A battle for survival. That is the reality facing Tottenham Hotspur right now, and in this video, we're going to break down exactly how it happened and whether there is any way back. Stay with us because this story is bigger than football. Let's start with a game. A specific game, one that, when you look at the numbers, is almost hard to believe. Tottenham at home in a North London derby, one of the biggest matches in English football. And here's what happened on the pitch. Arsenal had 61% of the possession, 61. They had 20 shots, Spurs had 6. In terms of touches inside the opposition penalty area and the area where goals come from, Arsenal had 46. Tottenham had 7. The final score was 4-1 to Arsenal at Spurs' own ground. Now here is what makes those numbers even more alarming. These two teams met at the Emirates earlier in the season, and the stats were almost identical. Arsenal dominated that game too, so this is not a one-off bad day. This is a pattern. This is the gap between these two clubs, and that gap is enormous. Different man in the dugout, same old problems on the pitch. On top of all of that, man, this is important, Tottenham are absolutely ravaged by injuries right now. We are not talking about one or two key players missing. We are talking about an entire starting 11 worth of players unavailable. Think about that for a moment. The club's backup goalkeeper has now also picked up an injury. A midfielder was asked to play as an emergency central defender. Young players are being overworked and asked to fill multiple positions every single week. In the second half of the Arsenal game, you could physically see the exhaustion. Players losing battles they should never be losing. A 20-something being left for dead by a forward running at full pace. And here is what makes it even more troubling. This is not the first time Spurs have had an injury crisis this severe. The manager before Tudor dealt with a similar problem, and the manager before that did too. At some point, you stop calling it bad luck, and you start asking serious questions about the club's approach to player fitness, workload management, and squad depth. Quick pause. If you're finding this breakdown useful, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of in-depth football analysis. And subscribe if you haven't already. We do this every week. To truly understand what is happening at this football club, you have to zoom out, way out, past the tactics, past the players, all the way to the top. Tottenham are, by revenue, one of the 10 wealthiest football clubs in the entire world. Let that sink in. In modern football, money is everything. Studies consistently show there is an extremely strong link between how much a club pays its players and where that club finishes in the league. The rich get richer. The structure of the game is built for clubs like Spurs to succeed. And yet, here they are, staring at the relegation zone. The questions being asked inside and outside the club center on the ownership. Has the investment been there when it needed to be? Has there been a clear footballing vision? Has the right people been put in charge of making football decisions? For years, the club was shaped almost entirely by one figure, a chairman who held enormous power and made most of the key calls. When he left, something many fans had been calling for, there was no real transition, no handover of knowledge, no structure waiting to take over. And so everything, the decision-making, the football philosophy, the recruitment strategy, everything just fell through the cracks. People inside and outside the game. People inside and outside the game are now openly saying the club needs fresh ownership, new energy, a full reset at the top. That is a stunning thing to say about one of the most financially powerful clubs in world football. Let's talk about players, because the squad Spurs currently have is, and this is not an insult, it is a diagnosis, mismatched. Too many players were signed for a future that never arrived. Too many were brought in as projects, as potential, as players who might develop into something special in 2 or 3 years. The problem? Football does not wait for maybe someday. When you are fighting to avoid relegation in March, you need players who are ready right now. Players who know the league. players who have been in pressure situations before and know how to handle them. A significant signing arrived in January, a midfielder brought in from a major European club. In theory, exactly the kind of proven, experienced player Spurs needed. In practice, he has looked uncertain, still adjusting, still trying to find his rhythm, his sixth start for the club in that Arsenal game, and he looked like a man who had arrived at a party 3 hours too late and was still trying to figure out where the drinks were. That is not a criticism of the player. It is a reflection of the timeline Tottenham are now operating on. They do not have time for players to settle in. They needed results yesterday. There is also a darker dimension to the squad, talk of internal divisions, of cliques, of scar tissue built up over multiple failed seasons, coaching changes, and broken promises. That kind of damage does not disappear with a new training drill. So let's address the biggest question directly. Can Tottenham Hotspur actually be relegated from the Premier League? A year ago, most people would have laughed at that question. Even 6 months ago, it felt far-fetched. Today, it is a genuine, serious possibility. Here is why. Tottenham have not won a single league game in the entire current calendar year. Not one. Meanwhile, the clubs directly below them are improving. One club that was struggling earlier in the season has finally found form under a new coach. Another had an unlucky defeat at the weekend, but still looks more organized and dangerous than Spurs. The margins are shrinking, the points gap is not comfortable, and Spurs have a difficult run of fixtures ahead. The next match, away from home, has been described by some as the most important game of the season so far, not because of who they are playing, but because of what the result will tell us. A win lifts the mood, gives breathing room, shows that Tudor's influence is starting to work. A draw is progress, but not enough. A defeat, then it is serious. Then it is alarms blaring. Then we are genuinely talking about the biggest relegation in the history of the Premier League. Because if Tottenham go down, this would not be like previous famous relegations, where clubs overspent and ran out of money. This would be a club that had every financial advantage the modern game offers and still found a way to fall. That would be, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary failures in the history of English football. Let's say, for the sake of argument, they do go down. What actually happens? The financial hit would be significant and immediate. Television money drops dramatically outside the top flight. Sponsors, many of whom have contracts tied to Premier League status, would need to be renegotiated. Matchday revenue would fall. But here is the complicating factor. Tottenham have very large fixed costs, a massive stadium, a huge wage bill, infrastructure built for a club competing at the highest level. You cannot simply cut all of that overnight. At the same time, some people in football actually see a relegation as an opportunity, not for the club, but for investors. A club of Tottenham's size and commercial strength trading at championship prices, that is what some in the business world would call a buying opportunity. The club is seen as well-structured commercially, even if the football side has been a disaster. And that distinction matters if you are thinking about who might want to take over and what the future could look like. In other words, even in the worst-case scenario, this is not the end of Tottenham Hotspur. It would be a humiliation. It would be painful, but the club would survive. And with the right people in charge, they could come back stronger. The question is whether the right people are there to make that happen. It is a strange and sad thing to watch a club with so much potential waste it so completely. 6 years ago, Tottenham were in a Champions League final. They were supposed to use that moment as a launching pad. The new stadium was open. The world was watching. Everything pointed upward. Instead, that final has become a ghost, a reminder of what might have been, a peak from which they have been falling ever since. The new manager says what is needed is a mental switch, and he is right. But that switch needs to happen at every level, and on the pitch, in the dugout, in the boardroom, and in the ownership box. One win could change the mood, could lift the pressure, could give everyone just enough breathing room to regroup, but one win does not fix a broken system. It only delays the reckoning. What happens next at Tottenham Hotspur will be one of the defining stories of this Premier League season, and we will be watching closely. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely. This took time to put together, and I hope it was worth your while. Now, here's something I want you to know. I personally read every single comment on this channel, everyone. So drop your thoughts below, whether you think Spurs will survive, whether you blame the owners, the players, or the manager. I want to hear it, and I will reply. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with one person who follows football. That is genuinely the best way to support what we do here. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.